welcome back on Bicara Minggu Ini, and I'm your host, Norman Goh. Today, we are following up the next story on Malaysian Women in Journalism series. In the first part on Breaking the Newsroom, Discrimination and Sexism, and we have an independent broadcast host, a TV host, and also she has a lot of accolades when we come to her work. She's been into acting, into a lot of work, but she's also I would say I would call her an activist when it comes to issues on women and a lot of things as well. So I'd like to welcome Tehmina Kaoosji into the show today for first part on Malaysian Women in Journalism. Welcome to the show.
Hey Norman, thank you for having me. Such a pleasure and happy to see you doing this series.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, we've seen Tehmina a lot on Bernama TV on the show The Nation, and I would like to give her a shout out on even right now I'm having a tea with Tehmina, and that's her new show, Tea with Tehmina.
That's
Bobby,
right.
you can tell us your a little bit of your show. I just want to give you the shout out on the show. What about this the new show that you have on Tea with Tehmina?
Okay, so in a nutshell, Tea with Tehmina is a thrice weekly talk show where I get up close with Malaysian women talking about lived realities, challenges, experiences on all the latest topics covering women, society, and commerce. And I thought it was really important to seize this opportunity to highlight women's experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly, but also actionable solutions, because it's a highly underrepresented part. Women are a majority population in Malaysia, but we're still a marginalized minority, and there's no time like right now to change the narrative.
I think you're right on that, because when you cover on The Nation, okay, before we go deeper into issues on breaking the newsroom, you're in the TV broadcasting itself, so we'll go deeper into that type of issue. But we're looking at, when you cover The Nation, politicians, analysts, even experts. Now, I remember sharing this with you, even my own podcast, when I cover on current issues, more than 60% of the listeners or even readers online are men, while women only constitutes about 30%. So, I would like to hear from you. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the problem mainly is that when it comes to the media industry, there is no gender-sensitive culture, and that is reflected in not just programming, but the manner in which reports, special editions, and etc., and the daily news cycle is produced. So even when I produce and present for Bernama TV, or when I do it independently, writing op-eds, etc., I always ensure that there is a component of gender mainstreaming, which basically means women are an integrated part of the conversation. Give you a really simple example. Let's look at just the terminology and the mind frame that we have when we speak about youth or belia. I bet you're thinking young men. I mean, I'm also personally thinking young men, but hey, youth actually involves young women too.
And you see a lot of this youth activism coming out
Exactly.
in Malaysia itself.
Yes, yes.
Who's leading them? Women.
Yes, leading the charge, but at the same time also talking about gender mainstreaming in all the arenas: economics, politics, social justice, and it just tells you if there are not enough women in the room, it's going to show in your policy making, in the weaknesses in structures, and ultimately in how far or how quickly society and development progresses.
And also we're seeing the problems as well, that when it comes to political news, where it's often men being projected to the front, and when it comes to issues on women, you get women to talk about it, and it's very, very narrow type of issues where women usually being put on a pedestal to talk. Now, how do you change that?
How you change that is by normalizing the presence of women experts, and also by ensuring that as media professionals, as broadcasters, we put in that extra effort, that extra mile, or sometimes 100 it takes to find female experts on the topic as well. Don't keep going to just the first page of the Google search when you're looking for experts, be they economists, be they politicians, be they industry leaders. Champion women just as much as you would men.
It's like how I deal with this show. I remember I have this conversation with a friend. When I did 5 episodes, I realized, oh no, all the 5 episodes are men. That was, thank God I didn't have a friend to tell me that, hey, I think your shows are all men. And I realized it myself. This is a conscious decision to normalize and mainstream more women. It is not about, the whole show is about women. But women can talk about finance, women can talk about markets, women can talk about migrant workers, for example.
Absolutely.
There are so many experts among women in this issue. It's not just about men. So we'll go deeper into one of the main topics that we have today. It's,
Sure.
You have established yourself quite well as a TV host, an independent TV host, writing shows, interviews, currently focusing on show women. I was reading you have a Wikipedia page. It's like, wow, yeah.
Thank you for that. It's important so that there's no confusion.
Because
and the tone is set.
And plus, that's good for branding anyway.
That's right.
Yeah, aside from LinkedIn, it's important. Yeah, what influences your decision to take up journalism studies during your college days?
I would say that I was one of those kids. I grew up reading the outside of what my roti canai was packed in, the newspaper, or letting the food get cold and then getting to the food, And when I was very young, back when I was still living in India, where my father originates from, my father actually used to work for one of the biggest print publishers
that's
of one
an
of the
influence from your
newspapers. Of one of the newspapers. So I did spend some of my childhood actually within that, intoxicating, heady smell of freshly printed newspapers. And it was a very early introduction as well into media freedom, freedom of expression, media ethics, even hate speech, because I do remember back in the early 90s when there were communal race riots in India, the printing press had to stay open. And my father, keeping it open, ensured that there was also a free flow of proper, verified information getting out to the general public, smack in the middle of bloody, deadly, communal riots. So that has sort of, I think, always influenced my path along the way, and then it came to the time when, what are you going to take up in university? So I actually chose mass communications with a specialization in journalism and psychology over law.
Oh, I mean, being a kid growing up in an Asian family, it's either lawyer, doctor, accountant, engineer. That's sort of stereotype that we have.
That's right.
I remember same thing because my mom was my clinical instructor in nursing as well.
Okay.
So I got influence from my parents, and from here you got it from an early start. Your dad working in the newsroom. So when you started, what was it like when you first started your work in the media broadcast industry? Both film, it is different in film industry and as well as broadcasting as a TV host. But do you see news or TV host as a boys' club?
I would say when it came to the broadcast industry itself, in the beginning, the opportunities were always stilted and more deliberately focused towards certain types of topics. I'm talking lifestyle, entertainment, fashion, or travel. So I decided to, in that sense, go with what I personally felt at least was the least stupefying. And I've done everything from, as a 13, 16-year-old casting for MTV hosting, etc., all the way to what eventually landed up being my first proper broadcast journalism gig was as a broadcast journalist for Tourism Malaysia's online channel. Traveling and reviewing places, doing in-depth interviews on policy as well as the local economy and how it was impacted by tourism, etc., etc. So from there all the way to the shift into more hard news, politics, economics, social affairs, it has to be a very, I feel, deliberate choice that one makes as a female journalist and broadcaster, because there is always the risk that you will become pigeonholed into dealing with so-called light topics, entertainment, fashion, etc.
Malaysia is no exception, and we do have remarkable investigative journalists, women journalists as well.
Absolutely.
Digging into really, really compelling stories, migrant workers, human trafficking, even sex workers. Now, those are really, really tough. Even, for example, Rage story on predators among our mates.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look at the fantastic young female journalists on the Rage team.
Yes, without their stories, we don't know what's going on. So, I'll bring you back onto this. The Malaysian Media and Gender Report by IFJ, International Federation of Journalists, released in March 2015. I think they should update that.
That's right.
Yeah, it's been 5 years. So, then again, I feel that this is still very prominent on some of these issues. Women surveyed were primarily employed in newspapers. That's 54.08%. Only 5.76% work in television. So do you see a growing number of women in television industry? Has things changed since? Or is it still the same with less opportunities for women in this segment? I remember IOJ did the survey, I think it's 2018.
2018, that's right.
Yeah, that was good. We're showing women getting paid better than men.
Slightly better.
Slightly
a 5% margin, if I'm not mistaken.
But when it comes to making decisions in newsroom, it's still not there. So it's even more prominent in broadcast industry. So what do you think about this? Or do you think things have changed?
Well, I feel that now more than ever, today in 2020, even while we're in the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, and the fact that a lot of physical newsrooms, particularly dealing with print, though they have closed down or contracted, you still see great representation amongst women's participation. However, just like you pointed out, the decision making and policy design participation is still extremely low. We have very rarely had women chiefs or women heads of departments or even heads of newsrooms, and that ultimately impacts the end product of what the media covers, all the way from how we cover stories of economics and policy, whether or not we include women amongst youth, whether or not we include women amongst marginalized and B40 coverage, whether we include a sensitive angle when we're dealing with violence against women, from rape to murder to even teenage pregnancy. So all of this is impacted by, ultimately, we as journalists know who commissions the story. And if your editors are quite uniformly male across the board, that will impact how you produce the news. As recently as 2005, NST had a women's editor who was a man. Now these things have changed, hopefully, about 15 years down the road.
It kind of reminded me of one of the agency in the government, the family planning unit.
That's right, very recently.
Yeah, we don't go too far on that, but it just goes with the societal problems that we face. These are the challenges of the crazy man's world.
There has to be an effort, Norman, I feel, to deliberately reconstruct our patriarchal social structures, and that can quite simply be done still through merit. There are many extremely capable female journalists and media practitioners working in the industry, and if we're able to give them their due by giving them the positions that they deserve, rather than only looking at the gender component of, is she A, married? Is she B, does she have a family? How much commitment? Why do we never look at it in that way when we're looking at platforming males who are capable, right? But that again goes back to the deep-seated gender discrimination and sexism that actually encompasses all spheres of our life, all the way from the domestic to the professional. If we are comfortable platforming male editors, etc., I'm sure many of them are married, they are family people, but we never think, his family responsibilities would get in the way. Why do we think the same for women? It's because of imbalanced gender roles.
Correct. And I think COVID-19 has also shown us that it doesn't matter whether a women may have a family or they can work from home. It doesn't matter, because by merit, they are good at it. And even if they have a family to take care of kids at home, it doesn't stop them to be actively in part in the newsroom, for example. So that shouldn't be any reason anymore not to have more women in this workforce. I mean, World Bank has already mentioned it very clearly. You want to get back to your economy back on the feet, get more women into the labor force.
Absolutely.
Because there are so many, I remember this number again, it's 70% of Malaysian graduates who are women compared to men. Of course, I will ask what happened to the men. Are they dropped outs? No, not exactly, because the social mobility for women are moving a lot better than way before. So you
Absolutely.
work in film industry as well as aside from your work in broadcasting as an independent TV host. A long list of local and international films produced depicting female journalists. I mean, recently locally, um, a friend of mine who acted in that movie, I was taken aback with how the story was written and depicting a female journalist. More than often, female journalists on films are not depicted in a positive way, stereotyping and objectifying female journalists, getting scoops by means of sexual approaches. So, what do you think about that?
Okay, my whole 2 cents on that, Norman, is that that's a lazy old trope of female journalists being unethical and just imprecations being cast upon and aspersions about our professional capabilities because we're often reduced to only our appearances or only our bodies. So there is always a feeling of, well, she couldn't exactly have gotten that scoop, right? Unless something else, XXX. And despite the fact that female journalists globally have called out and repeatedly reassured not just their readers, but they have made public statements saying that we definitely do not sleep with our bosses or sources, etc., to get quality, ethical journalism out there. The stereotype still exists. It still prevails because there is no mass effort to re-educate society to all of these implicit biases that we have just because we see a woman on screen or we see a woman's name as the byline. Yeah.
Yeah, that these are some of the few things where when we look at movies like that. But we also seen the role where Meryl Streep played in The Post.
Yeah, that's right.
Although she's not a journalist herself, and it's her husband's company, but we can see that strength and the leadership she held as to lead the Washington Post. And we also seen characters in Spotlight and so many others where I think even there's one new series I spotted out from BBC. It's called The News, and how women were taking charge and telling their bosses off, and that's not how you write stories. I mean, one of the important key things where as journalists we tend to forget, our stories should not have that sort of negative impact or brings harm to people. No, our story should not bring harm to people. It should be of public interest. It should be helping the public to make the right decision. Next time we look at the usual things of what's happening in newsrooms or even in TV stations. What are among stereotypes you have experienced or heard or seen among friends towards women in journalism? How
Right.
will you suggest addressing this? I think from my own friends I have heard a lot. I want to hear from you. What do you think?
Well, I'll refer to a survey that was conducted by the Institute of Journalists Malaysia, with which I am a board member and director. Back in 2018, we conducted the first ever Malaysian media sexual harassment survey, whereby we were able to gather 9 interviewees, all female, who decided to, on condition of anonymity of course, go on the record speaking about their deep-seated lived experiences with sexual harassment on the job. Now, the most alarming thing to us that we discovered from this survey was not only the depth of sexism and harassment that each one of these women had to deal with. The stories ranged all the way from 1995 to 2017, over the span of so many years, decades. And the behavior has really not changed. On top of that, all the individuals whom we actually spoke to, remember, these were women in journalism, they've actually left the industry. So I think that points to another very worrying trend, and throwing it back to what we were speaking earlier, yes, there's more women's participation in the media industry, but are the conditions in the media industry, all the way from sexual harassment to a slight gender wage gap as well, and all these overriding conditions, it leads to a lot faster drop-off of women. They do not build sustainable careers in the media industry because of institutionalized policies which actually allow for sexism, sexual harassment to take place. So it's very worrying indeed.
Yeah, when I read the report when it came out, it was, it hit to myself and said,
Yeah.
have we, all this are happening under our noses. What have we done? are we keeping quiet and let it, oh, it's just another report? No, it shouldn't be just another report. A new policy should be in place. I did ask some of these questions. Certain radio station happened.
That's
Certain
right. Back in
newsroom.
2018, I did actually cover and do a panel on that. Most immediately, even amongst the civil society arena, conversations were reignited because that came sort of hot on the heels of the refocus on the Me Too movement. I feel that what is most lacking is that organizations, be they media organizations or those in the corporate and government sector, do not have the type of mainstream policies and atmosphere that allows for freedom of reporting, where it comes to victims and survivors speaking to somebody in-house, mostly because there's a lot of shame and taboo associated with the entire situation of sexual harassment, combined with the fact that women are afraid to speak up for fear of being disbelieved, and also they feel that they would be at risk of losing their job. So this actually enables a more predatory environment. And it's very difficult to get out of that mindset because unless you have the type of budgeting that allows for every department in every, let's say, newsroom to undergo anti-harassment training. Is the way in which, everyone is talking about the Black Lives Matter movement globally. So we talk about don't be racist, but no, the more important conversation that's actually been coming out is that we have to be anti-racist. The same way, you cannot just be just disagree with sexism. You have to be anti-sexist, and that involves training, sensitization, re-education, all the way from the top level management to everybody who's working within the newsroom as well, so that sexually objectifying comments, repeated unwanted sexual advances, they actually become a thing of past in our lifetime. And that won't happen unless we do something very actionable, instead of only addressing these topics when the unfortunate occurs and some woman or individual has been so trod down that they are forced to speak up. This should be an everyday thing.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we've also seen a lot of courageous women taking on Twitter, and happens to be
That's
someone
right.
I know. They've been telling the stories, and we know that this thing, sexual harassment, happen not only to women, happen to men too.
Absolutely.
And the locker room syndrome. Most of the time, boys usually get away with saying it's just a locker room talk, but no, this shouldn't be a norm. It shouldn't be acceptable at this day and age. So I'd say it is very, very destructive behavior in many newsrooms. So how have we handled this so far?
I would say by and large, some newsrooms, of course, do better than others, but there has to be a conscious decision made to have policies that clearly outline what is acceptable behavior, what is unacceptable behavior. And when it comes to unacceptable behavior, stalking, harassment, purposefully getting a female colleague's number and then relentlessly messaging or harassing her over social media. So all of these are still actually commonplace enough, meaning which there's also a division between what we do in our private time as media professionals and what we do during our time at the office. But managements also have to be sensitized to the fact that a lot of it happens when we're not technically on the clock. So you've got to address that, and at the same time ensure that you're working in an atmosphere where you can't be making off-color comments at female colleagues in the presence of many others too, particularly junior female colleagues.
What do you think about, although we've seen some companies taking, or even newsrooms are taking some proactive role,
Yeah.
what do you think of legislating this? This is, make it into the federal law that we are not going to tolerate this. And it will be good because it will be a good platform to discuss this in the parliament. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Absolutely. I think it's important to garner the support and build public interest in not just having this instated as legalese and policy, but I have to also point out that the legal provisions, they would be the end game. And while we're still waiting for that to be legislated, which can be a long process, we do have to also work on the public and the institutional education and re-education, because you can't try and do one and neglect the other. Everything has to come together. It would be the icing on the cake if we were to get the gender equality bill and the sexual harassment laws and policies instated via Parliament, via the Constitution. Fantastic. But you cannot ignore the fact that you need the on-the-ground education and in the newsrooms.
Yeah, the societal changes must come from a bottom up.
Sure.
And it has to come in a whole package. But addressing the elephant in the room, as we talked earlier, where newsrooms in Malaysia used to, and still is, dominated by men. And stories are often skewed or insensitive towards women, objectifying women, or paints women in a very negative way most of the time.
Yeah.
Even putting graphics sometimes to a point of using degrading and sexist headlines. Even recently I think news agency do it too. Just because she's pretty, she's from Terengganu, she's willing to be a petrol station service in a frontline service. So what do you say about that? This has to change now, or is this going to take a long time to address this?
It needed to change yesterday, but when it comes to gender relationships and media language, we've also got to look at the psychological component, and it's about having not just the editors, but the journalists themselves, male or female, mind you, trained in the power of language, particularly because today I think every newsroom primarily focuses on their digital output via their social media channels. So let's say if you've got a problematic headline that says, and even this is a problematic headline, woman raped. By who? Or it's something about violence, or it's something about that says woman on top. This is a pornographic reference. Why don't we say female leadership? Why aren't we talking about women at the top of their career, etc.? So we have to be very conscious about how the psychological aspect of wordplay actually performs as not only clickbait, but further entrenches what we believe as a society. Look at the fact that to this day, in 2020 even, despite the fact that, COVID, pandemic, etc., but if there are ever raids on any illegal outlets, entertainment and otherwise, you will always see a lineup of scantily dressed women being photographed. Why do we need to be photographing those arrested in the first place anyway? That just performs as clickbait. And on top of that, you are reinforcing gender stereotypes against women dressed in a certain manner. Look at what happened in Parliament most recently, where imprecations were cast upon not only our first female deputy speaker, but also upon Batu Kawan MP, YB Kasturi Pato. So these show how normalized our commentary and our sexism is. It's really deep-rooted, and it's going to take a conscious effort by editors, by journalists themselves to QC and see right before you hit the publish button, is this representing women, minorities, and even the overall development and ethical news agenda properly? Every headline.
Now, looking forward, going back to the main topic we talk about, the breaking in newsrooms in addressing discrimination and sexism. What would you say in the future? How do we move ahead with all this? And what would you say to a lot of journalists and aspiring journalists who's listening to the show right now from Tehmina?
Okay.
How do you look forward to this? How do we change this? And what do you see in future in Malaysia?
Right. Well, as an independent broadcast journalist, the advice that I can give is that you have to be very certain about what your goals are within the media industry. And if the opportunities are not accessible, you have to stay dogged, stay stubborn, and committed to improving the quality of your work. And also, with all the tools that we're equipped with these days, digitally and otherwise, social media, use that to also not just practice, but work on stories that truly matter to you. As an independent broadcaster, over the pandemic, I also hosted and produced my own online talk show that was called The Point, whereby we deliberately featured women always on the panel, be it economists, be it those talking about journalism, be it talking about migration and other social issues. So when you make deliberate efforts to give voice to women, and to work on stories that highlight women's lived realities as part of the integrated society. And you have to stand up. Let me give you another example. Back when I first started out in broadcast journalism, it was seen as rather unnecessary for a woman to be hosting a budget special. I ended up at the end of the day being the only host for the budget specials. But I do recall in the most recent budget special, I had to insist on being the primary host because it was deemed necessary that a male host accompany me. I resisted and I pointed towards the previous years where I had most capably hosted and produced the full budget special myself. So you do have to not just stick to your guns, but be very certain to be able to back up your stance through your ethics, through your journalistic integrity, as well as through the quality of the work you produce. It's a hard road, but I think it's extremely rewarding.
That really sums up very well on this episode with Tehmina, and thank you so much for joining me in this show. And this is Bicara Minggu Ini, talking about Malaysian women in journalism. It's time to really break the newsrooms because it's time to change what has been normalized, and because this is going to be a new norm. Doesn't matter who's going to lead, but we should give that sort of space as well to our female journalists. It shouldn't be the old ways anymore. And thank you so much, Tehmina, for joining me.
Thanks, Norman, for having me on the show.
And you're listening to Bicara Minggu Ini, uncovering current affairs and politics. You can listen to the stories and interviews on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts on iTunes. For more updates and stories, if you have any suggestions, you can tweet to me at I'mNonGo. Thank you. Have a pleasant week ahead.